Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is furnish. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear furnish used is to mean to provide a house or room with furniture. So you're going to see different examples of this used in sentences later. We're also going to talk about how it connects to a pretty common adjective, furnished, to describe um, apartments many times or homes that are for rent. A second way you'll hear the verb furnish used is to mean to supply someone with something. So sometimes as you attend conferences or various meetings, uh, organizers might note what materials or things are being supplied or furnished. A third related way you'll hear this verb used is to mean to give something to someone. So pretty common here, and pretty much connected to that second definition of supplying something, giving something. And our fourth way you'll hear furnish used is just to mean to provide something. You should know that furnish is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing to form furnishing. The past tense and participle forms of this verb can be made by adding ed. I've actually used this form already a couple of times, and you might have noticed as I'm adding that ed sound, when I go to say it, I'm pronouncing it with a T. And that's because the end of this word, the last sound in this word, is sh, an unvoiced sound. That's why I'm making a T and I'm not adding an extra syllable as I say it. So the end of this word should sound like this: furnished, furnished. Okay. Now let's take a moment to look at two phrasal verbs that you might encounter. They both really have the same meaning. So you might hear furnish for or furnish with. Both of these connect back to those second and third definitions where we were talking about supplying or giving something. I've got two example sentences here for you to look at. The first is, the volunteers will help paint these rooms, but will furnish the supplies for them. Okay, so we're going to provide these supplies, right? The actual paint, maybe the brushes, the rollers, all of those things needed to paint a room. A second example sentence: the ship is furnished with food, right? So it has been supplied. Now, before we do a little more practice making sentences with our verb of the day, I want to talk to you and review active and passive voice. Most of the time when I make sentences in my videos here, I use the active voice. And that's what you're going to hear and see the most as you're reading in English. An active voice sentence begins with the person or the thing that is responsible for the action. Sometimes it's helpful to think about the person or thing doing the action. So I've got two example sentences to help illustrate that. John washed the dishes. We know that John is responsible for the action of washing. In the second sentence, Susan cooked dinner. We know that Susan is responsible for the action of cooking. Now, today we're going to compare the passive voice. Passive voice sentences begin with the person or the thing that is acted on or that receives the action. The person who is responsible for the action might not even be included in the sentence, but if they are, they're going to come at the end following the preposition by. So I'm going to take my first sentence, John washed the dishes, right? The dishes are what received the action of washing. So my new sentence in the passive voice would be, the dishes were washed. And I could put a period there, and that would be fine. I can also say, the dishes were washed by John. Okay. My second example sentence, Susan cooked dinner. Dinner is what was acted on or what received the action. So I'm going to begin my passive voice sentence with dinner was cooked. Okay? And again, I could also say dinner was cooked by Susan. Those are some examples of passive voice, and we're going to be making more passive voice sentences with our verb of the day in just a moment. I always like to take a moment though and answer the question why? Why do we do this? And it's not only English that does, many other languages also have active and passive voice. But in English, many times someone is using passive voice because they don't know who is responsible for doing the action. So they're not sure who to say is responsible, right? So it's just easier to kind of talk about the thing that is being acted on. And a connected reason might be that person that is responsible for the action, they just might not be all that important. And instead, the person who is writing or the person who is speaking, they want their audience to focus on the noun that is receiving the action. So we call that emphasizing the object. Okay. This also comes up when it relates to sentences that sound like blame, where we're saying something bad happened, and it might be a little tempting, right, to say this person made this mistake, right, or did this bad thing. But sometimes that seems a little aggressive. It seems a little harsh to kind of point our fingers and say someone is responsible. So if we use the passive voice, we can avoid assigning blame. So we can just say, a mistake was made. That sentence is not indicating who is responsible for the action of making the mistake. So now that we have a little understanding of active and passive voice, let's begin to look at some sentences with our verb of the day, furnish. Today we're going to focus on the simple past tense. And as a review, we use the simple past tense when we're talking about an action that was completed at a known point in the past. Sometimes you'll see time signals, words like yesterday or last week, maybe a specific date in the past, but they do not need to be in every simple past tense sentence, right? If I'm talking with my friend about something that happened yesterday, I don't continue to say yesterday in every sentence. And as my friend asks me questions, she doesn't continue to use that word yesterday, right? And once it's sort of established, it's known, and we can continue on with our conversation. So in a lot of my videos, we practice making simple past tense sentences in the active voice. And so I'm going to kind of point out the structure in active voice, and then we'll look at the structure in the passive voice. That might be the new point. So in the active voice, I start with my subject, right? Then I'm going to use the ed form of my verb. And this is true no matter what my subject is. In the passive voice, things are a little bit different. I'm going to use my subject, right? Or object, pardon. I'm just checking if you're listening. I'm going to start with my object, the person or thing that was acted upon. Then I'm going to use a past form of be. So that's going to be was or were, depending on what my subject is. Then I use the participle form of my verb. And because furnish is a regular verb, my participle is the same as the past tense. So let's take a look now that we know kind of our pattern here. Let's look at these two sentences. I think you're more likely to hear a passive voice sentence with this verb furnish. So let's start with that one. The apartment was furnished with second-hand things. Okay? So this might mean that someone, right? We don't know who is responsible for this, for the action of renting an apartment. They have put furniture, things that were previously owned. So they're not brand new things in the apartment. That's all that sentence means. Now let's look at it in the active voice. Now we're going to know who's responsible. The landlord furnished the apartment with secondhand things. Okay. Again, both sentences are fine to use. I thought today was a good time to practice passive voice because I see so many examples of it with this particular verb. Now, let's talk about making negative sentences in the simple past tense. In the active voice, I'll have my subject, then I'm going to have did not, and then the base verb. So notice I don't use the ed form in the negative here in the active voice. But in the passive voice, right, I'm going to have my thing that is acted upon, or the object here. Okay? I'm going to have was or were, my past forms of be, then not, and then the participle form of the verb. Okay? Again, let's start with the passive voice and look at a sentence. The school's weight room wasn't furnished with full sets of equipment because of cutbacks. So here, if you think of weight room, think of exercise machines, many of them with weights. They might not have been able to have kind of all of the full amount, all the different weights, all the different levels, because finances, right? Financial reasons here that cutbacks indicates it's a money related problem. So now in that sentence, again, we don't know who is responsible. But if we look at our active voice, we're going to see the school district didn't furnish the school's weight room with full sets of equipment because of cutbacks. So now we know who is responsible. Lastly, let's look at making some yes or no questions with our simple past tense. In the active voice, I start with did, then I have my subject, and then the base verb. So again, no ed here. So in the active voice, I'm only using the ed form of my verb in the affirmative. In the passive voice, I start with was or were, depending on the object that comes next, and then you're going to see the participle form of the verb. Here are my last two examples. Was veterinarian assistance furnished? This might go back to provided, our fourth definition there. Or in the active voice, did the nonprofit furnish veterinary assistance? Did they provide it? Okay. Now let's move on and talk about some words that are related to our verb furnish. And the first word we're going to discuss today is the noun furniture. So most of the time when you hear this used, we're going to be referring to large, movable equipment, items like tables and chairs. And you can find furniture in houses, offices, and other spaces. And it exists to make things just a little bit easier for living, for working. Easier, more enjoyable might be another way to say that. So an example of this, we're going furniture shopping this afternoon. Right? So you might be curious, kind of like, well, what kind of furniture, right? You could ask that follow-up question, but it could be any large number of things, couches, desks, you name it, right? We could go on and on about furniture. The next related word we're going to talk about is something I mentioned a little bit earlier. Furnished with the ed, but I'm still making that T sound there, can also be used as an adjective. You'll most commonly see this to refer to spaces that can be rented with furniture already there. So for most people, they might think of apartments, but this could be homes. It could also be offices or other physical spaces. An example of this word in a sentence might be, they're looking to rent a furnished home for the next year. And one more related adjective here. I'm going to add the prefix un to the beginning of my word here. And for any of my students, current students watching this or former, we talk a lot about prefixes. And when you see the prefix un, I immediately want you to think not, or in this case, without furniture. So again, you might see this used in various ads if you're looking to rent a particular place. So an example of this might be, this unfurnished apartment's rent is $1,000 a month. And depending on where you live, that might seem very cheap, but it also may seem very expensive. So housing costs vary greatly throughout the United States and throughout the world, really. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.